Hey everybody, welcome to a weekend edition of This Day in Hockey. I took a couple days off. On Thursdays we tape our podcast, Sticks and Taps, myself and my dear friend Paul Cuthbert. So trying to stay away from it and let it breathe a little bit. We have a lot of fun with it if you haven't had a chance to check it out. And I think some people anyway these days have a little bit of time to play with if you're looking for a hockey fix. These are much shorter. Those ones go a little bit longer, but we try and add some great stories in, and I expand on them a little bit, and Paul's great to bounce things off of, and on that one, we, just to give Sticks and Taps a little bit of a plug here, we do finish pretty strongly with an Irish connection. We play some Irish music at the end, even though we're out of what I informally refer March as a St. Patrick's month, albeit much different this year, given the circumstance globally, but we're going to keep it going. Paul's got strong Irish roots, as do I, and we're really enjoying that. I got to be honest, it's heavily Clancy Brother flavored, but we'll mix it up a little bit down the road, but we're having fun with that. So, on Thursdays, and I guess I didn't do one yesterday either, so here we are, Saturday, it's a beautiful day. I've got a pint going, I'm going to have a whiskey soon, and celebrate the day, and had a great workout earlier, wearing my property of St. Leonard's Elementary, greatest elementary school in the history of the world, where the most organized ball hockey in the history of the world also took place back in the day, courtesy of Phil Bure. Tell that story another time, perhaps. But a couple of moments on this day in hockey, April 4th, and I'm going to start with 1971, and Bobby Orr, and it was never a bad place to start. Now, a little bit of irony in this sense here, because on this day in 1971, the Bruins spanked the Habs pretty good. They beat them 7-2. It was the final game of the regular season. I believe it was a Sunday. And I remember watching it. I think it was on the CBS Game of the Week or NBC Game of the Week, but I remember watching it because Phil Esposito got a hat trick, and Bobby Orr got 2 assists. He assisted one of Esposito's goals, and he assisted a goal scored by Johnny Pieface McKenzie. I think it was the final Bruin goal of the game. And that gave him 101 and 102 assists for the year. I mean, his numbers were unheard of. Now, Espo had a hat trick. He scored 76 goals that year. Again, unheard of, shattering the previous mark. And Bobby ended up with 139 points, and that record still stands to this day. No defenseman. Paul Coffey coming the closest, 1 point short in 1986, and we talked about that not that long ago. So, but here's what I like to give a little bit of the rest of the story, and why this is significant is the Montreal Canadiens head coach was a man named Al MacNeil. Like, the Canadiens went on to win the Stanley Cup, and they beat the Bruins in the first round. But Al MacNeil took a lot of heat. He took a lot of heat from Henri Richard. He took a lot of heat from John Ferguson. And he was summarily dismissed at the end of the year. And this is a Stanley Cup winning coach. And they basically said, go coach our farm team. And they brought in Scotty Bowman. So nice little move sideways and up, I guess. But Al MacNeil was a Stanley Cup winning coach. The point of it is, the Canadiens' last 3 games of the season, keep in mind, they had brought Ken Dryden up in March. But what Al did is he was playing them intermittently. So the final 3 games of the season, the Canadiens have a home against the Bruins, who it looked like for sure they were going to be playing in the first round. Did he play Dryden against either of those games? No, he didn't. In the first game, which was Montreal's third last game, a game they lost to Boston 6-3, he played Rogie Vachon. Then on the Saturday night, he came back, he had a game against the Rangers, he played Dryden, and the Canadiens won 7-2. Then they go into Boston the next day, get waxed, Espo's hat trick, Orr's 102 assists. Bruins win 7-2. That's 2 games in like 3 days. They spanked the Habs. And he played Phil Muir. And then he opens up in Boston that week with Ken Dryden, who they had not seen. And really the hockey world, for all intent and purposes, hadn't seen. Ken had played 6 and won them all, but he really wasn't on anybody's radar screen. And I just think it's kind of it really is one of those ones, the rest of the story, because of those final 3 games. And Al MacNeil went on to work in the Calgary organization, very respected hockey man. He was a pretty solid defenseman when he played pro, including in the NHL in the 1960s. He went down to Nova Scotia, and you can read Larry Robinson's book, and he'll tell you what Al MacNeil meant to the start of his career. He started his pro career in Nova Scotia, and Nova Scotia won the Calder Cup, becoming the first Canadian team ever to win the Calder Cup in the American Hockey League. So a little bit of sort of the rest of the story there, all from April 4th, 1971. But I think it's pretty cool. Al MacNeil maybe deserves a little bit more credit than he gets. I thought that was pretty shrewd. If you look back in hockey history, how he managed the goaltending and then sprung Dryden. And I will say this, I've talked to almost everybody on that Hab roster and many on the Bruins rosters. They wouldn't have known it like Montreal did. But Yvon Cornway even told me, Liam, we couldn't score on Dryden in practice. We were not surprised that he was getting the start, that's for sure. So on to 2 years later, April 4th, 1973, first game of the playoffs now between the Chicago Blackhawks and the St. Louis Blues. A series Chicago would go on to win and would advance all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals. And in that game, two hat tricks. Two hat tricks recorded in that game for the first time in NHL history. Pitt Martin and a defenseman named Dick Redmond. And this is going to be where I go with this one as I expand on this particular story. So, Pitt Martin's real name, by the way, most don't know, was Hubert Pitt Martin. And he had a hat trick that night. They beat St. Louis 7-1. And Stan Mikita had 5 assists that night. But I want to talk about Dick Redmond. So, Dick Redmond had a hat trick that night, became the third defenseman in NHL history to have a 3-goal game in the playoffs. And I touched on the 11 guys, him being one of them, obviously, about 10 days ago or so or whatever, and I was winning mine on my first one of these. However, there is a trivia question that came out. The first guy ever to ask me was Gord Wilson, my buddy, who we toasted not that long ago, was recovering from some health issues, including the COVID-19. I think he's well on the way to recovery, and God willing he is. He was the first guy to ask me anyway. Now, I'm going to phrase the question the way it needs to be phrased, because it's routinely butchered. This is the way you should say it. If you don't say it this way, you add in a number of different parameters, okay? So the question goes, two brothers, okay? Two-brother combination, where one of the brothers had to have scored a 50-goal season, and the other brother, or the same one who scored 50, had to have played for the Montreal Canadiens. So the first criteria is you need at least two that are brothers. The second is at least one of them had to play for Montreal. And the third is at least one of them had to have scored 50 goals. But it doesn't have to be one or the other. It could be the guy, for example, the Richards. Maurice and Henri Richard never played for anybody but Montreal. But the Rocket had 50. There was two brothers, so they qualify. People have guessed the Mahovliches. Well, neither Frank or Pete ever scored 50 goals. So the Richards would be one. And the reason I'm saying the question today is obviously because of Dick Redmond. Dick Redmond had a brother named Mickey. Now, Mickey played for the Montreal Canadiens, but he had his 50-goal season for Detroit. But he qualifies under how I phrase the question. Two brothers had to have a 50-goal season. One of them had to play for Montreal. That's all the criteria. Nothing else has to match up. So if you say it that way, the Redmonds count as well. The Bures, Valerie and Pavel. The Turgeons, Sylvain and Pierre. The Espositos, Tony and Phil. People forget that Tony Esposito played 13 games for the Montreal Canadiens in 1969. The Dionnes, Gilbert and Marcel. How many is that? Oh, and the one that nobody ever gets, the hardest one of all. The Pronovost, which is the one when it first came to me. And I was disseminating how it was being phrased and asked and doing the addendums and everything else. I said, well, hold on a second. Do the Pronovost count? Well, who's the 50 goal? Well, the 50 goal scorer is Jean, of course. Yeah, okay. But we never had a brother. Marcel didn't play for the Montreal Canadiens. I said, no. But he had a brother that played for the Montreal Canadiens. He had Claude Pronovost. Played for the Montreal Canadiens. He was a goaltender, a backup goalie. Back in the day of only the one goalie system, he filled in a few games for the Boston Bruins and one or two, and he filled in for one or two games for the Montreal Canadiens. So there's the two brothers, and Jean's brother, of course, had the first 50 goal scorer in Pittsburgh Penguin history. So there's the 7, I think, if I got them all. Pronovost, Richards, Bures, Espositos, Turgeons, Dionnes, and Redmonds. Is that 7? Let's play it back and count them. Anyway, April 4th, 73, Dick Redmond and Pitt Martin create a little history, and there's a little bit of a sidebar story to you. And then we'll finish up today. With kind of a neat one, because there was a franchise in the NHL, the Seals. They came in, they were part of the modern expansion in 1967, and they lasted until this day in 1976. This was the final game ever in Seals franchise. In fact, it was the final game ever in what they called the Bay Area of California, of Oakland, if you will, until the Sharks came back in San Jose in 1991. So the Oakland Seals became the California Seals, became the California Golden Seals. They had the white skates, they had the yellow in the sweater and the gloves, and then they came back to being the California Seals. They changed ownership a number of times, and on this day in 1976, they played their final game ever in Oakland in what was I believe it was called the Oakland Alameda County Coliseum, if I'm saying that correctly. And they beat Los Angeles 5-2. And the final goal ever scored in Seals history on this date, April 4th, 1976, was scored by a man named Jim Moxey, who played junior in Hamilton for the Red Wings. He was drafted by the Seals, and he scored the goal. It was an empty netter with 2 seconds to play in the game. Dennis Marook scored in the game as well. He's become a dear friend of mine. He got his 40th of the season. And they had some players, they had a couple of decent players. Anyway, they moved to Cleveland and become the Cleveland Barons. And they play out in an arena called the Richfield Coliseum, which at that time was the biggest rink in the NHL. The attendance for seating there was 18,644. No other rink was that big at that time. And they played there 2 years. And they played their first game ever in the Richfield Coliseum against the Los Angeles Kings as the Cleveland Barons. And scoring their first goal was Fred Ahearn, and drawing the first assist was Jim Moxey. Scored their last goal, got their first assist about 5 months later, something like that. So a little bit of synergy there for the Seals franchise, which had a few snakes and ladders, shall we say, along the way. And then in Cleveland, not much more hockey success. And then they merged. The Gund brothers, who owned them, struck a deal with the NHL, merged with Minnesota, who kept their strongest players. That was at the conclusion of the 77-78 season, and it produced an anomaly in the NHL draft where you had more players taken in the first round than there were teams. Another question, another story, another time. There you go. Anyway, on this day in hockey, April 4th, those are a couple of quick stories for you here, and we'll finish by, of course, getting out the trusty elixir of life. And I'm going to toast today my 89-year-old mother, who's confined, obviously, to quarters with her man there, and in Barrhaven, as most seniors are. If you have a senior parent or grandparent in a home, the odds are, I believe, you probably haven't been able to see them. I know I can't go in to see her, or my brothers can't, so we're waiting for, obviously, things to calm down a little bit, and maybe that'll happen. But in the meantime, for all the seniors who are stuck inside, because let's be honest, we know in the country and globally what's happened if a diagnosis has been made in one of the homes. So everybody, please be careful there. And so I'm saluting all of our grandfathers and grandmothers and mothers and dads and uncles and aunts who may be caught inside during this time, as we all try and outwait the global pandemic and come up for air, hopefully sooner rather than later. Have a great rest of the weekend. G'day.